My name's Leah. I work for Hakalau Forest National Wildlife Refuge. I am the visitor services manager. So that means I'm like the volunteer coordinator and I do outreach stuff. So I do kind of a variety of things. So our refuge was founded in 1985, largely because back in the 1970s, was looking like Hawaii was in danger of losing most, if not all, of its native forest birds. So they conducted this forest bird survey throughout the entire state. And this guy named Dr. Michael Scott, who was the first endangered species biologist hired by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, well, he identified this spot on Mauna Kea as kind of the best hope for saving our native birds. And so through all our partners and whatnot, thanks to their help, they established Hakalau Forest National Wildlife Refuge. That's on the windward side up on Mauna Kea. Now, have any of you been up to the refuge or know where Mauna Road is?
No one's been on Mauna Road.
Oh, so if you go up the Saddle Road and you get to where you'll take that right turn to go up to the observatory, you turn on that road, and then Mauna Road is this kind of rough dirt road that you'll take a right not long after you've been on that road. And it just kind of follows the contour around Mauna Kea, and then you get to Hakalau Forest. And I'll show you, there's a good picture looking down on Hakalau Forest when I get to kind of the end of my slideshow. Now, I said before that I'm from the kind of mountains of North Carolina. That's home. But our mountains are not nearly as tall as Mauna Kea. Does anybody know, first off, how tall Mauna Kea is?
No.
Roundabouts. You don't have to be exact.
What do you think, Trinity?
I'm having trouble hearing, so.
Oh, sorry, Trinity. You were muted that whole time.
Tragic, really. It's the tallest mountain at sea level, which is, I guess, something to be proud of. I was up there once. I got altitude sickness, had to come back down, got really sleepy, probably almost died. I don't know.
Wow. Yeah, so Mauna Kea is really tall. Like you said, you can get altitude sickness. It's like 13,800 feet, so really, really tall. So the highest mountain where I'm from is only 6,600 feet. So not really going to get altitude sickness, even if you're all the way up on the top. So very big difference coming here. We also have another unit that we manage as a refuge, our Kona Forest unit. Kona Forest is actually its own national wildlife refuge, but doesn't have any staff, so it's managed by Hakalau Forest. So what I'm going to talk about today is all the amazing Hawaiian honey creepers, our native forest birds. So all these things that you see kind of right here, these are Hawaiian honey creepers. Now, all these birds evolved from this generally this one type of bird, this group of rose finches that arrived here sometime between 7.2 and 5.8 million years ago. So the Hawaiian Islands looked very different at that time. There was no Oahu, so it looked like a very different place. Now there's 60 plus species that once called Hawaii Island home, and all these birds had specialized bills that enabled them to feed on different types of food. So here in this like circle, you can see they're kind of separated into categories. So you got nectar feeders and generalists. So you got kind of this like more what you think of as kind of a traditional bird's beak or bill. And then you've got these really long ones for reaching inside flowers. And then you've got hunters of small prey, so things like insects and fruit and seed eaters. And then there's some that kind of like fall into kind of several of these categories because they're more generalist kind of omnivores. And the refuge is home to several endangered forest birds. So what do we mean when we say that a species is endangered? So what we're going to look at is, this is the kind of scale, and you read this from right to left. So we start out at least concern, then we go to near threatened, and then within the threatened group, there's vulnerable, endangered, and critically endangered. So we're going to talk about these different categories. So first is the vulnerable category. How do they determine whether a species is vulnerable or endangered? Well, there's a lot of factors that kind of play into that. And vulnerable is a species that has experienced 30 to 50% population decline, and there's less than 10,000 individuals out there. And that kind of equates to the people out there doing the science say that that species has a 10% chance of going extinct sometime in the next 100 years if we don't kind of change the trend. And also, as we move on down to endangered, they show a 50 to 70% population decline, 2,500 individuals, and a 20% chance of going extinct in the next 20 years. And we have several in this endangered category. In vulnerable, we have the EEV, and then we've got several others, which I'll talk about as we kind of go through our slideshow here. And then critically endangered. Critically endangered, there's 80 to 90% population decline. There's only 250 individuals or less, and a 50% chance of going extinct in the next 10 years. So what are some of the birds that we have on our refuge? We'll start out with the generalists. And the generalists that I'm showing here, the Amakihi and the Apapane, they are not in that threatened category, so they're not endangered species. And part of that is due to the fact that they are generalists. They feed on a variety of different foods, so they're not dependent on one other species or one specific plant to get their food from. Excuse me. And because they're generalists, that means they're going to be a little more adaptable. So the Apapane here, this red bird, if you see a red bird here on the island, well, there's really, if the bird is mostly red, there's only really 3 birds it can be. There's the Apapane, there's the EEV, and then there's the northern cardinal, or the other red bird. So if you're in Hilo or down at the beach and you see a red bird, chances are it's a cardinal. But if you're out in the forest, there's a really good chance that you're looking at an apapane. Some of the specialists, now we don't have these on our refuge. We do have the Palila very close to our refuge. It tends to be at a little bit higher altitude. Both of these birds are endangered, but some of the specialists that we have on our refuge are the Akiapola owl. Now, the Akiapola owl is bill is very specialized for its food source. What the Aki likes to feed on are these little weevils that will kind of dig their way into the bark of a koa tree, usually in kind of like a dying limb or whatever, and it's eating that kind of underside of the bark. Well, it can sense the vibrations, basically feel it as it lands on the branch. It can feel where that weevil is at under the bark by the vibrations it creates. And it will open its beak and use the lower portion of its bill to peck a hole into that branch, much like a woodpecker. And then it'll use that upper bill, that curved, longer, skinny bill, to reach in and fish it out, kind of spearfish for that weevil and pull it out the hole that it created. And I've got some pictures that I took on the refuge of one of those birds doing just that. So it's kind of snapped off this koa stem, and it's pegging a little hole there into the end of that stem. And it reaches in, and you can see it just gets a hold of that weevil and pulls the weevil out. And that's the Akiapola owl is entirely dependent on this for its food source. So you can imagine if something happened to our koa forests, or that the weevils, so the insects that it targets, then it would be out of luck and that bird would really be struggling. And the Akiapola owl is one of the most endangered birds that we have on the refuge. It's less than 1,000 individuals out there, so it's a really rare bird. And next we have the EEV. Now the EEV has that really curved bill. It's very recognizable. They're easy to spot when you're on the refuge because the fact that they're red, they stick out. And the EEV is not as much of a specialist as the Aki because it feeds on a variety of nectar from different species, but it does just have that one kind of food source, nectar. Now, the EEV's bill evolved over time to so that it can reach down into these flowers and get out the nectar. And when it reaches in, the flower will deposit pollen on the EEV's bill and right there on their head. So they'll pollinate flowers as they go along. And birds like the EEV are very important pollinators for our native flowering plants. And they also, it's not just their bill that kind of evolved for their specific food source, also their tongue. You can see this center image where the EEV is sticking out its tongue, and it's got this kind of like, it looks like a little brush, and that's to help it get a hold of that nectar. So how are the birds doing? How bad is it? Well, across the state, there's been 71 of our birds that have gone extinct. 31 are listed as threatened, so they're in those like categories that we talked about. And of those 31 birds in the threatened category, 10 of them have not been seen in over a decade. And then there's 11 that are listed as stable. So these birds that are listed in the stable category are birds that are kind of recovering. For instance, our state bird, the nene, was listed as threatened, but it's been kind of downgraded because the population is doing a lot better. Also, here you'll have like things like amakihi, apapane. So we do have birds that are doing well, but we've lost a lot. And what have we lost? So here's some art of these various birds that have gone extinct, some of them not too long ago. So the Hawaii o'o, for example, went extinct in the early 1900s. There was some conservation effort that tried to go on. They tried to transplant those birds to some of those birds to another island to try to kind of give another population of that bird to try and save it. And ultimately, those efforts failed. And here are a couple others, and you can see like some of these not until like the 1940s, 1980s, 1990s. So really fairly recently that have gone extinct. Why are we losing our native forest birds? So it's pretty complicated. There's a lot of reasons why we're losing these native forest birds. Kind of the first factor that we've got right here is the introduction of predators that these birds have not evolved with. Things like cats, rats. While rats may not like attack birds directly, they do feed on eggs in the birds' nests and things that prior to coming here, I never thought that mongoose would attack and kill birds, but they do. And as you can see here in this bottom picture, this mongoose has a apapane that it has caught. And other factors that have led to the decline are things like other introduced species that, while they don't attack our native forest birds, they compete for a lot of the same food resources. So non-native pollinators like bees and birds like the Japanese white-eye. The Japanese white-eye is really an omnivore, but as it's kind of introduced to our environment, we find that it really, really prefers going after nectar in these places like the ohia, and all that kind of adds up to increased competition for those native food resources. And then finally, we come to things like loss of habitat and land use change. So if we go way back into Hawaii's history, like before contact with Europeans and contact with like the Americas, there were no cattle in the Hawaiian Islands, and contact with Europeans brought things like cattle and pigs, a new species of kind of pigs that kind of intermingled with species of pigs that were brought by the early Polynesians who arrived on the islands. And all this has this cumulative effect on the environment. So cattle are really important, and especially as we kind of come into more modern times, they become very culturally important as well. And so you would have native forests that would get converted to pasture land for these cattle. And as these native forests get cut down and converted into pasture land, these forest birds are losing their habitat. And while they can handle that in some respect, but it was on such a large scale that it was just really added increased pressure and kind of reduce the areas that our native forest birds could live. And then when you look at, when you look at the effects pigs have on the understory in our forests, you can see this before and after picture. So pigs were previously excluded with fencing in this one area in the before photo. And then for whatever reason, the fence gets knocked down or a tree falls on the fence and pigs get into that area. And they really change the composition of plants in that understory. And there are a lot of understory plants that our native forest birds depend on for food and nesting habitat and also safety. Because if the forest is kind of more open, there's a higher chance that those birds will become food for something like an eo, like our native hawk. So finally, there is kind of the last kind of part that I want to talk about here as far as why our numbers of birds are decreasing are disease and climate change. And another introduced species is mosquitoes. Now, mosquitoes, obviously, they're annoying. We don't like being bitten by mosquitoes, but mosquitoes also carry diseases that are detrimental to our native birds. So they carry diseases like avian pox and avian malaria. Now, avian malaria is almost always fatal to our birds. And yes, mosquitoes do land on and bite our birds. And if they get avian malaria, it's almost always fatal. And in addition to that, you have things like avian pox. Avian pox is a disease that is much more survivable for birds. It's kind of like when we get chicken pox. When after we've had it, we're probably not ever going to get chicken pox again because we have an immunity. Well, but the cost for our birds is much higher. So when they get the pox, if they get those pox on their legs, just as a kid, we get chicken pox, we want to scratch it. Birds are the exact same way. They don't have fingernails, so they're going to kind of peck at it, and it will get infected, and birds will lose toes, they'll lose legs, and in some cases, they can lose their upper or lower bill. So it comes at kind of a high cost to our birds as well. Now, how climate change kind of plays into that. Mosquitoes don't move up Mauna Kea very far because mosquitoes don't really like cold weather. And as climate change kind of increases our overall temperatures, annual temperatures, visually we see things like you'll hear your parents or your grandparents say, wow, there's not as much snow on the mountain this year as when I was a kid. Or I had someone tell me they can remember years when there was snow still on the mountain in July. And sometimes people saying there was snow on the mountain year round. And as we see these kind of subtle changes over time, that's due to increasing temperatures from things like climate change. And the temperatures have this more drastic effect. They interact with all the other little subtle factors that are playing into reducing our native bird species. And that warming climate is interacting with these mosquitoes. And as the climate warms, they're going to be able to move further up the mountain. So right here, you've got kind of this, obviously not Mauna Kea, but just kind of show you, this is where the tree line is at, this yellow line. And Hakalau Forest is down here inside this, below the tree line. So it's right there, nice forest. Mosquitoes will come up about halfway into Hakalau Forest. So if our native forest birds want to get away from the mosquitoes, they have this tiny area that they can exist and be safe from mosquitoes and therefore be safe from those diseases. Now, as climate change has more of an effect, the temperatures increase, that line of where the mosquitoes come up on the mountain is going to increase. And the amount of habitat that we have for our forest birds is going to get more narrow and more narrow year after year. So the amount of habitat they have is going to decrease. Now, there is some good news. First off, there's an easy fix for some of the problems. And one of those easy fixes is something as simple as building fences. So we're not advocating, obviously, for the eradication of pigs throughout the Hawaiian Islands or cattle or anything like that. As I've mentioned, those species are very important for not only things like food source, they're culturally very important as well. So what we do advocate for is keeping those species out of some of these sensitive areas, these areas that are critical for our forest bird habitats. It is possible to find a balance where we can have things like pigs for hunting and cattle for food, and also have our native plant life and our native wildlife. It's just, it's going to take kind of this lot of effort. And it's very important. So you can see in this picture, this side of the fence here on the left side is inside the refuge. And we got this fence that will prevent cattle and also pigs from getting inside the refuge. And then you can see on this other side how different the plant life is. And back in 1989, one of the refuge biologists, his name's Jack Jeffrey, he's a big bird photographer. You may have heard of him. He took some pictures on the refuge. So this 1989 photo shows kind of what the refuge looked like back in the early days of the refuge. And then in 2008, this is that same place. And you can see how when they added the fence, all these native understory plants started to regrow in there. and you can restore the forest. And thankfully, that's what's been going on at Hakalau, and that's why we have this place where a lot of our endangered species within the boundary of the refuge is starting to stabilize. And another good thing is that people are becoming more aware of the plight of our native species, and they're setting up more protected areas, setting aside areas to be protected. So in these blue boxes show where endangered bird species kind of where they call home, basically. And there's quite a few of these high concentration areas or ideal areas around the island. And then the red are the protected areas. So ideally, we want to see more protected areas inside these blue boxes so that we know we're protecting the right areas, not just any and all areas. And the amount of protected areas are increasing. You can see here, this red area up here on the today side is showing Hakalau Forest. You can see down here our Kona Refuge, and then a lot of this area is places like Hawaii Volcanoes National Park. You've got Department of Hawaiian Homelands lands. And so some people ask, well, why don't we just get all this land inside these blue boxes and protect them? Well, a lot of this land is privately owned. Or they're owned by different companies, different organizations, they're owned by ranches, etc. So kind of the key is not just buying this land and turning it into national parks or refuges. One, it's not possible. And two, no one wants to see like the federal government come in or the state government come in and own everything and just like keep people out. The key to protecting these lands is really forming things like partnerships. So there's a lot of stuff that private landowners can do to protect their lands. Cattle ranches can do things like building and maintaining good fence lines. So even though while they may not be like restoring vast areas of native forest, the fact that they are building and maintaining good fence line is really contributing to protecting the land. And also, the other aspect of good news is volunteers and partners. Hakalau Forest National Wildlife Refuge now has about 11 employees. And back when the refuge was started, and really for the first 20 years of the refuge only had 5 or 6 employees. There's 33,000 acres to Hakalau Forest. There's absolutely no way that the refuge employees could protect or restore that amount of land. All the credit for restoration of things like Hakalau Forest goes to our volunteers and our partners. There's been thousands upon thousands of people who volunteered on the refuge, students who come up to the refuge and volunteer through things like teaching change. There's all these other various programs with the universities, even things like scouts come up and do various projects on the refuge. It's really this large community effort. And restoration of the refuge is not simply something like putting plants in the ground. it also is education. There's all sorts of things that you all can do, either volunteering with the refuge directly, volunteering with other organizations that do work on Mauna Kea, uh, groups like the Mauna Kea Watershed Alliance. There's the Friends of Hakalau Forest. There's numerous organizations. And also, if you can't get up to Mauna Kea, just encouraging friends and family when they talk about, oh, we're going to plant some plants in the yard, maybe do a little landscaping, just encouraging them to kind of look out for and plant maybe native species. This all kind of goes into saving these endangered forest birds. And that brings me kind of to the end, to open it up for questions for you all. And this is that picture that I mentioned earlier that looks down on the refuge. So when I took this picture, I was sitting on Mauna Road, and down here, this is our staff bunkhouse, because we'll have staff that stay up there through the week, because it's a 2-hour drive up to the refuge. And all this forest that you can see here is Hakalau forest, and you can kind of make out our fence line and how it's different outside the refuge versus inside the refuge.